Welcome into this week's episode of Your Drone Questions Answered, brought by Drone Launch Academy. I'm your host, Chris Breedlove. Today, I'm excited to welcome, I think, my second repeat guest, Calvin Rikard, my former colleague at Duncan Parnell. Calvin, thanks for coming back on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
We're going to talk about ground control points. Are they truly necessary for public safety scene documentation? But Calvin, before we kind of get into this, just briefly, please reintroduce yourself to our listeners.
Yep. So Calvin Rikard, I am currently employed with Duncan Parnell as a public safety specialist. My background prior to Duncan Parnell was 23 years with the South Carolina Highway Patrol. In the last 17 years of that, I was assigned to their collision reconstruction unit.
Absolutely. So with that, Calvin, I guess, where do you want to start?
So it was really the only time in my career, Chris, that I could say this is literally a train wreck to my other colleagues. You know, we always talk about some of the cases we have, but this was actually a train crash. And one train was stationary after unloading some cars at like a depot area. And then there was an Amtrak train that was headed back up towards, I think, the DC area. You know, this has been adjudicated, so there's a report already out on this. But I think the final result was somebody did not switch the signal and the train went right when it should have went left. And there was a crash. Several people were injured up into the hundreds. And then there was 2 fatalities involved in this.
Oh,
This was, I got the call Super Bowl Sunday, 2018. It's one of those cases that I'll never forget. And as a law enforcement officer, you always have a couple cases, and this is definitely one of those. We had helped several of the federal agencies that day document both trains where they came to final rest. And they asked if we could fly the drone as part of that process. And so, you know, we did that. And at that point, we had kind of been taught by another individual to basically lay out a 100-foot tape measure, those points, and then we would be able to scale our ortho photographs based on that scale restraint. We did all of that. We really didn't process the data per se. We turned it over to the FBI, and I'll never forget it. It was July of that year. I got a phone call from an FBI agent in DC, and he was asking me, what did I use for ground control points? And I know to you and probably your listeners, I talk funny, and I'm well aware that I speak different than most people. And so I had explained to him about the scale restraint that we had laid down. And he again asked me about ground control points. And so I repeated myself, and he said, I understand that you put out scale restraint, but he said, what did you use for ground control points? And there was awkward silence just like then, because I had no idea what he was referencing at that point. And so the next 10, 15 minutes, he kind of educated me a little bit on ground control points. And here we are as a state agency that is reconstruct all these collisions. I didn't really understand the technology, the application at that time. I kept his voicemail up to the time that I retired in 2020. But the last thing he told me was it might be something we want to look into. And he was referencing ground control points. I'll go to case number 2, which happened about 2 months after that. So August of 2018, we were assisting a local police department with a fatality. Happened in the morning hours on a major highway that would go towards the interstate. So kind of had traffic at a gridlock. They had asked us to come in to assist in the documentation. They didn't have the resources to do that, so they've called us on several other cases. We went out. We did what we normally do. We flew the drone. We laid down our 100-foot tape measure as a scale restraint. We actually processed this data because this was going to be a chargeable offense, which has since been adjudicated as well. As a supervisor of the unit, I was responsible for reviewing that case prior to it getting published out to the local police department that we were assisting. And the first thing I realized is when I was reviewing the material that the investigator I was working with did not have the ortho as part of his background, which was at the time, it didn't catch me off guard, but now that I look back, it was something he always did. It was always known for him to use the ortho as his background instead of the model look that we were usually accustomed to. And as soon as I turned on the ortho, Chris, I realized that something wasn't right. And I remember calling him into the office, and he says, Calvin, you know, we used Pix 4D at that time to do our process. And he says, I processed it 3 times in Pix 4D, and it is still not coming out right. And when I mean right is our command staff at the time said we could fly the drone, we could use that as a background, but we still had to shoot all of our roadway evidence, like final rest of cars, skid marks, gouging, anything else of items of interest. And then we would have to shoot some checkpoints with the roadway features, yellow lines, lane lines, to help make sure that the data set was correct. When we looked at it, we could definitely tell our 100-foot scale was measuring 99.98 feet, which for government work, we were okay with. And 72 feet south of that, which there was like a negative grade to that area, the car where we plotted it at final rest was about 4.5 feet off where the ortho was showing the car at final rest.
Mm.
And I knew at that point something wasn't right. And my thought process went straight back to the FBI guy about ground control points. And, as the supervisor of the unit again, I was like, I don't know what ground control points are, but we got to figure this out. Within the agency itself, a couple months after that, one of our team members flew a drone on top of a pine tree. We figured out that I hope there's a statute of limitations on this, but none of us had 107 license. We had created kind of a COA on our own. Our command staff said, we're not flying drones anymore until everybody gets certified and licensed, which was the right thing to do. So at that point, Chris, I'll be honest, I knew what ground control points, so kind of what the theory was behind it, but I didn't care about it anymore because we wasn't flying the drones and I was worried about our other caseload and trying to make sure that we were efficient and getting those cases processed and out the door. So it really didn't come back up till after I retired in 2020 when I was working with another state agency and they kind of had the same kind of issue. We were talking about RTK equipment that we had that Trimble was supplying us and manufactured. I had asked them to take it up to the mountains, where they didn't have good cell signal, where, things just didn't work. You didn't really want to stop cars because you couldn't get out on the radio. So they found a place up in the mountains. I'm not going to say where, but it was up in the mountains. And I got a phone call in a couple of days saying that our stuff didn't work or their processes wasn't working. And so I wasn't sure what he was talking about, but we got together and they were used to kind of flying 400 feet off the roadway, taking a single photograph, documenting their scene if they could, if it was that small, using the scale restraint within their scene, and then processing the data. They had a different manufacturing software, and their stuff was still off by feet. And so I kind of made it a point at that time that whatever ground control was, again, I knew what kind of the theory was, but not the proper application. I said, I got to figure this out because I'm not going to go around and put Duncan Parnell, put Trimble Forensics, put myself on the line and saying, hey, use this equipment and then not know what the proper application was. And then put these officers in a bad situation like I was with that case that I was assisting a local police department. It just wasn't worth it to me. So started doing a lot of research and I teamed up with another forensic, public safety specialist from the Midwest. And we just started really focusing on the proper processes and using ground control points in how we actually collect that data so that we could educate our fellow colleagues in the best manner that we understood it to be so that they, again, didn't get themselves put in a bad situation.
Absolutely. Let's just walk it back for a moment. We were trying to say, hey, ground control points, are they necessary? Are they not? But let's define really quick, what do we mean when we say, just in general, a ground control point versus a check shot? What are we even talking about?
So ground control points would be identifiable areas, spots within your scene that is taken with either an RTK, total station, PPK data, so that when it is processed in the photogrammetry, the software knows what that scale factor is, so that when it processes that 3D point cloud or orthomosaic, that it is scaling it correctly and not leaving it based on the drone's GPS, the metadata, and whatever else that photogrammetry software is using to help process that. So it's just very known, identifiable points within your scene so that you make sure that you do have a true scaled diagram when it gets processed.
Absolutely. Yeah. Ground control point simply means, to your point, identifiable marks, targets, and you've collected that position with the total station, with a GPS receiver, whatever the case may be, and you're now feeding those known coordinates per point into your Pix 4D, whatever photogrammetry software. And that's the key. And then I think the other side note of that too, but a checkpoint could be the exact same thing. You just exclude it from the registration, registering either that point cloud down or in your triangulation step. Checkpoint, that can be confusing for people, I think, is checkpoints and ground control points can be the exact same physical shot of a location with a target. It's just, do you or do you not include it in that
Correct.
initial process? And if you exclude it, now it's a great horizontal and vertical check. So thank you for defining that. Please press on.
Yeah, so me and my coworker Tom Erdman with Silent Instruments, we got together, started doing some in-depth research in regards to control points. And we actually did a presentation later that year at a conference down in Florida. But in the process, we actually reached out to Pix 4D. That's who we were both familiar with. And I know there's other, photogrammetry softwares out there, but, we were dealing with Pix 4D. I wish I had the screenshot. I've saved it because they gave us the online free training for Pix 4D, but they brought up the importance of how ground control points, well, the importance of them for your scene. But they had one statement, and that thing has stuck with me, for 5 years now. But it basically stated, and it might be word for word because I've recited it so many times, but the accuracy and the way that we select our ground control points needs to be 3 times more accurate than what our final representation is. And so I look at, I've always kind of compared it to surveyors, and I'm like, if they're off a little bit and, it's however they're measuring stuff, that is a big deal. And I didn't know it was such a big deal that they could actually lose their license for, which makes it even a bigger deal. But I go back to the statement I said to you earlier, like I've got to be 3 times more accurate in how I collect this ground control point than what my final representation is, which in our case, it has to be dead on. Like we don't have a lot of room for error in the job that we're doing. That statement has stuck out and stayed with me for all these years because of how profound I think they made it sound for the importance of ground control points in any field that you're using, not just public safety, not just surveying, but any field that you're using, the importance of ground control points. And more importantly to me is how you collect that ground control point. We can have identifiable areas, but how we select that ground control point is just as important, if not more important than the ground control point itself.
Yep. To that point, right? I could have okay or even a pretty decent GNSS receiver, and I can have a 1 second shot, right? Maybe from a VRS network or some kind of network correction source. That's one thing. I might get pretty decent estimated accuracies in my collection software of that 1 second shot. Or maybe I take a longer observation. Maybe I log, right, for an average 2-3 minute like, so there's so many schools of thought, and that's just with GPS or GNSS, right? Versus total station versus whatever. I think to surveyors out there, that's all kind of old hack to them. But what would you say then is, have y'all landed on, or however you want to take this, as far as what is, and I hate to say good enough, but what is sufficient or good enough to meet this high bar? Is it averaging multiple GPS observations? Is it bringing a total station? What is the go-to move?
No, so I mean, again, we're a Trimble forensics dealer, and there are several different applications that we can use there. And what I'll say is, the software that we use, Capture, really helps not get those outliers. So when we shoot a control point, it is taking an average of 10 seconds of data to then give us that control point XYZ value or that known, altitude value. So I think the software does a great job at, if we're using it as control points to get that average set of data. And then when you process it, then you just have to look at where you're identifying that point at to where the XYZ value is that you're identifying, and then looking at what your error is. And you have to individually decide, am I good enough with that? Or, do I need to get another control point or whatever the next step might be?
Gotcha. For these cases, that the first two you brought up, were they already done, adjudicated, like for the history books? So they were not impacted by this sort of revelation of how key GCPs are to these processes?
Yeah, for lack of better terms, that was water underneath the bridge. Those cases were taken care of. I will tell you the second case, it actually went to court. Our processes kind of got brought up, and it was a very humbling experience. I don't mind calling it a passion It's just now educating people so that they don't have to experience that same line of uncomfortable questions when they're using drones and identifying points of interest and making sure that any type of analysis that they do off of that, it is actually true and accurate to the scene itself.
Yeah. What would a good realistic rule of thumb be for folks doing this type of work?
So when I was, reaching out to picks, I thought, well, maybe, a dozen control points, but this seems specific. But if you take the intersection case, a kind of rule of thumb that I've always kind of taught is a minimum of 5. You want to set them out like a 5 on a dice or a W. So you get geometry. We stress so much, not in a straight line, because I have gotten some weird projects from all the ground control points being in a straight line.
Yeah.
But, Duncan Parnell is actually a printing company prior to getting in geospatial. So we actually can print up placards, which are 4 squares that are different colors with a yellow center. So you can nail that into the ground and it gives you that very easily identifiable points. And we actually put 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So if somebody's using it in the drones and our GNSS system, total station, then sometimes they'll get a set of these ground control point targets. And that's how we kind of identify it. 5 on a dice or a W, make sure they're not in a straight line and that you have geometry. And then we also do teach about checkpoints, where we don't use that in the processing of that data. And that could be a stop bar line, that could be a manhole cover, the end of a lane line, the beginning of a lane line. There's a multitude of different options you have out there, but we just don't want to process that data just to make sure, hence the word checkpoint, that is actually overlaying where it needs to be overlaying.
Yeah. I think most people's experience probably tends to shade, I would think, towards area more so than corridors, unless they are, I don't know, electric utility, some other, pipeline, whatever situation may be. But yeah, avoiding the straight line thing, especially y'all care about the road, right? I mean, I guess the crash could have carried into an embankment or something, but I could say it'd be really difficult to not end up in a straight line if you're not really focused on, no, bring these, go into a soft section just because you want to get out of the alignment. So that makes a lot of sense too.
Yeah, it always seemed to throw my projects like I'm looking at it sideways, but from the top, and it, then I went back and took some of those out and then made it more geometry than a straight line. And then it comes in and looks like it should. So that has been learned over the years. And that's more of an error that I have found myself, that I've, tried to pass that along. Do not put them in a straight line, because it does not. No photogrammetry software I've dealt with likes straight line ground control points. So,
Yep. Yeah, 100%. Well, Calvin, I guess to kind of wrap this up, I guess any final summary or parting comments you want to make?
now 100%. And I'm going to go back to one other testing that we done. So me and Tom Erdman, as I stated earlier, went out to Ohio and we flew a drone, 583 pictures. Had to land it once to recharge, get a fresh battery in there. It was a large scene, and it was the first time I had seen it, Chris. But it basically created the bowl effect. So the sides were bowled up, so it looked kind of like a smiley face. And the only way we could get that corrected to where it looked like the normal lay of the land in Ohio, in Dayton, was to use ground control points. And we tested many, many theories. We had 3 days out there. They, Trimble Forensics done like a YouTube live segment on it. And we had people calling in saying, hey, try this. This is what we use. And the only way we got that area, which was a big area, had a lot of elevation changes, was to use ground control points, because we had one ground control point that was on the outer edge of our point cloud in ortho that we were off 17 feet in a 3-dimensional space. And that's the largest I've seen, but it was like 16.9 feet off when you measured where we shot it with a total station. And then when we measured in the point cloud, because of that bowing effect. And I've seen one where it didn't bow up like a smiley face, but it was more of a frowny face. And that individual said the only way that he could correct that was to use ground control points. Hand raised, from taking an oath, 100%. Please, I tell the officers I deal with, if I have to get on my knees and beg you, I will do that. But please use ground control points, just because I don't want to face the same scenario that I faced. And if it just takes 10 or 15 minutes to shoot those extra points, I think we owe it to the citizens that we service in a public safety manner we owe that to them to make sure that what we're presenting is the most true and accurate representation of that scene. And I always talk about if you're flying it for just overhead photographs and visuals, you can discount everything I'm talking about with ground control points. But if you're going to use it in an analysis to measure something, to do angles, then please, please, please use the ground control points. And I always leave it with this, Chris. In those cases where I'm off 4.5 feet, I've been off, less than a foot, and I've been off 16, almost 17 feet. If I could predict when I was going to be off those bigger amounts of distances, I could prepare for that. But I have not seen a rhyme or reason to when I'm off the larger amounts or I'm off the smaller amounts. So the only thing that I can tell you is that 100% of the time that I've used the drone and I place proper ground control throughout my scene, I have 100% of the time had a true and accurate representation of my project. And I'm good with taking that extra little bit of time to make sure that I can go into court and make that statement, because I think that weighs a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I can only imagine are already pretty stressful situations to begin with. So eliminate whatever variables you can, right? That makes a lot of sense. Well, Calvin, hey man, thank you again for coming back on the show and kind of going into this deeper dive. I hope a lot of folks out there, if they're public safety, this should really speak to them in doing this kind of work. And if they're not, hopefully I think there's still a lot of interest and some really good nuggets in here as well. And last thing for me will be if any other topic folks out there want us to tackle on this show, please send me an email at chris@dronelaunchacademy.com or visit ydqa.io, or if you're in the Drone Launch Camp community, submit your question there. Until next time, have a great week.